My name is Francesca Balzan. I'm an art historian who has specialised in the study of jewellery. I worked on my master's dissertation in art history regarding the history of jewellery in Malta during the Knights period, that is from 1530 till 1798. And the reason I chose this subject was because, first of all, nobody had actually studied the history or looked at or researched the history of jewellery in Malta, what was produced, what was worn, what value it had for society at the time, and that subject intrigued me. I felt it was a new way of studying the history of Malta through a new lens. There were other reasons. Apart from covering new ground, I also knew that jewellery was, to a certain extent, antique jewellery was being threatened at the time. A few years ago, the value of gold on the international market had risen dramatically, and a lot of people were trading old gold pieces for cash. And obviously these gold pieces were just melted down. Just their value in terms of intrinsic value of the gold was appreciated. Their historic value was completely ignored. And I felt that by studying jewellery, what it meant, what historic and artistic value it had, I would be able to protect this piece of our heritage, which had, to this date at least, not really been appreciated. Very few of our museums had collected jewellery in the past, and in fact Palazzo Falson, Historic House Museum up in Mdina, is one of the very few places, one of the few museums, which actually has a collection of the jewellery on display. Last February, I was asked to deliver a lecture at Biblioteca within the series Power, Costume and Scenography. And I decided, because it was going to be in February and around carnival time, to deliver a lecture about some unpublished research which I had made. And this research was about jewellery in carnival and social events. In fact, I titled the lecture Joyful Jewellery, Jewellery in carnival and social events. And of course, there were a lot of resources that I used at Biblioteca, within the collection, within the holdings of Biblioteca, which enabled me to present this study. What are the sources for the study of jewellery? How did I tackle my largest study, which was on the history of jewellery in the Knights period? Essentially, the sources are, very obviously, the pieces themselves, the surviving jewellery items themselves. So I looked in various private collections, church collections, which are extremely rich, full of antique jewellery which would have come to the churches through ex-voto donations of the faithful, of course, votive gifts of the faithful. And as well, I looked at other sources, for example, portraits of contemporary people who were depicted at the time when the painting was made, show people dressed in their beautiful costume. Of course, one would only pose for your portrait in your best costume and with your best jewellery on. So that was a very, very important source of information for me. Who was wearing the jewellery? How was the jewellery worn? And by whom? And of course, all historians look to documentation. We look at the manuscript collection at Biblioteca, which is extremely rich, a real jewel in Malta's heritage crown, if you like. And over here as well, I was able to find a tremendous amount of information from which I could extrapolate information about the history of jewellery and build up this history, which I eventually published. So during the lecture that I delivered at Biblioteca regarding jewellery pieces in carnival, quite a curious subject, what could there be in terms of jewellery within carnival, I was able to present this research, which was done principally on the Archilla, or the Rachel in plural. What is the Archilla? The Archilla is really a tradition that has been for centuries practiced during carnival. It is actually the recitation of a long poem in a theatrical setting, and this poem is based on a mock dowry agreement wherein a bride and a groom appear before a notary, and their parents usually accompany them, as well as witnesses, and a dowry agreement is drawn up. And this is all extremely theatrical because it is mock. It used to be recited on at the street corners in a kind of a play, which was very burlesque as well. People used to laugh, it was quite vulgar, it was in rhyming prose as well. And what is really interesting is, just like a normal dowry agreement, there would be a number of valuables listed. And for me, this was really interesting because although it didn't reflect an actual case, an actual dowry agreement, the fact that it was kind of lampooning or copying real life was an indication of what people were wearing, what people owned at the time in terms of valuables. And in fact, it is one of the few sources. The Archilla is written in Maltese and recited in Maltese, of course. It is one of the few sources where we find contemporary descriptions of jewellery in the Maltese language. So this is extremely valuable in terms of knowledge on history at the time, on the history of jewellery at the time. Now, what I did with the lecture in the lecture is I extracted the excerpts from these Rachel, where they had been published, because sometimes they were published, sometimes they come down to us in manuscript form, and in fact we have a few copies, extant copies within the Biblioteca, and there I was able to match up the jewellery that was mentioned with existing jewellery pieces in private collections and other collections. So it shows how realistic these poems, or this drama, if you like, was actually, and how correct it actually was. To show you an example from the actual Biblioteca collection, this is an 1826 Archilla, and it is handwritten, it's a manuscript, it's in manuscript copy, and here, throughout the text, you can read some references to jewellery. And here we have just an example. Imsielet ta' diamanti, hija għandha żewġejn. So, earrings. She's got 2 pairs of diamond earrings. And the sort of earrings that would have been popular at the time would have been these top and drop earrings. Should have sparkled at night. Imagine candlelight. Events, parties would obviously be illuminated by candlelight. And this is where the power of diamonds really comes through. If we talk about scenography, this is really an idea of what sort of wonderful scenes you would see in these events. And it continues. Rusetti tal-brillanti, hija għandha xi 200. Now this is an extreme exaggeration, as you would find in something that was written in jest. And what are these Rusetti? These so-called Rusetti are nothing but what we now recognize as these cluster rings. And these cluster rings are basically centering around a central diamond with rows of other circles of other diamonds around the central diamond. Now, traditionally, these Rusetti are linked to church prelates, and many times they were worn by a Monsignor, for example, a Monsignor, a church Monsignor, on the small finger. However, we do know of several instances of women wearing them, and this appears again in portraits. This is where portraits are helpful to help us understand how this jewellery was worn. Why does the Archilla say that the bride had 200 of them? 200 is a complete exaggeration. Well, in the past, they would have been owned in quite a large number, because originally they would have been used as buttons. It was only later, as they passed down through family inheritances, that the series of buttons would have been divided between the children, between the heirs, and if you're left with 2 or 3, what can you do with them? You turn them into a ring. And many times we can find this by turning them over and realizing that you have a so-called marriage. That is an original piece which is then amended and transformed into a different type of piece of jewellery. The back of a jewellery piece tells you a lot about its history, what it has gone through in the past. It continues. Jawar għandha nofsi naqqas taf se tagħmel bih. She's got a big quantity of jawar. What are jawar? Jawar are little seed pearls, and these were very, very prized in the past, and even nowadays actually they're quite well appreciated. They are tiny pearls which were used either strung as necklaces in great quantities because of their minute nature, or else they were actually sewn onto filigree pieces of jewellery. And we have examples of this sort in the Palazzo Falson collection. We've got earrings, for example, the tachombin earrings, which are again a top and drop, a drop which resembles the shape of a chombin, which is used in lace making. And there's also a necklace which has a number of rosettes, which is decorated with a number of rosettes in filigree, which is then encrusted with these seed pearls. And also a pendant which can be used as a brooch, which has exactly this beautiful gold filigree and then adorned even further with the addition of these tiny seed pearls. There are a number of other ritual throughout the 19th century, and in fact studies have been done by colleagues of mine, by other academics, by people like Conrad Fenech, who has published Archilla in great depth, and in fact his book now forms part of the Biblioteca collection as well. It's just that I looked at these ritual from the point of view of jewellery history, and a lot of information was obtained from there as well. Other things that are mentioned in these wonderful ritual that were recited in Carnival, as I was saying, for example, gold is mentioned consistently, and there's no surprise to that because the Maltese have always invested in gold. We have mentions of gold from the medieval period onwards. The Maltese feeling that they could invest better in gold than in jewels. In fact, it is only with the coming of the Knights to Malta in 1530 that we start getting a lot of references to gems and stones, precious stones, in inventories. Before that, gold keeps getting mentioned, pearls, coral. This is what the Maltese were investing in, and to this very day, gold is still one of the most prized possessions in a woman's trousseau. I want to show you an example of the type of gold that the Maltese would wear. This is an example of a very long necklace, the so-called barbazzal, and in this case it's known as talantaccioli. Antaccioli are sequins, and the reason they called it in that way is because the links resemble sequins. This happens time and time again with Maltese jewellery, and the names that are given to the types refer to other objects which they resemble. For example, you get the barbazzal tal-carfusa. Carfusa is a celery, which is a plant, of course. The reason being that the celery stalk, which is ribbed, slightly ribbed, resembles the link, the long link that is used in this type of necklace. So we get a lot of that, and all of this vocabulary, if you like, all of these names have been recorded in great detail in a recent exhibition that I curated in 2013 regarding the history of jewellery from prehistoric times till modern times. We produced a very detailed catalogue. This exhibition was organised by Fondazzjoni Patrimonju Malti, which produced this catalogue as well, and this catalogue is also in the Biblioteca collection. You get references to bottonieri tad-depi granellati. What are they? Well, they are actually buttons that were affixed to the waistcoat of a gentleman or even an ordinary individual who would invest in gold. And what does i granellati mean? They are made of grains of gold, which are soldered onto the surface of the button, such as this example. These have now been turned into cufflinks. Very typically, this happened in time when people stopped using these precious buttons and adapted them for modern usage. So these are very, very typical, and they get reflected even in the RHL. You also get references to all the common types of jewellery that were prevalent at the time. Imsilet tal-mosaic, micro-mosaic pieces of jewellery, very popular. A roll gets mentioned, coral. Coral has always been favoured by Mediterranean people because of its apotropaic qualities, because it is said to protect us from the evil eye, and as well it is extremely attractive. The red colour of coral is wonderful. We mustn't forget as well that coral has been found in Maltese waters since Roman times, so that is quite tremendous as well. The fact that we can source the materials for our jewellery from local waters is really quite something as well, and forms very much part of the history of our jewellery. But we've mentioned carnival as regards the common people, but what was happening on a different level? What was happening, for example, in the governor's palace? We're looking at the period of the British administration, so 19th century. We know that the carnival balls that were held at just next door at the palace, which is now known as the President's Palace, were very big affairs and taken very seriously. So seriously were they taken that the next day the newspapers would report about who attended these balls. Of course, it was only the upper class. Very rarely would you have Maltese, a few if at all. But basically all the people in the highest echelons of government would attend, and those in the entourage of the governor. And they would be listed by name, what they wore, a description of their costume, what they represented, and also mentions of jewellery, of course. And this is where I was able to glean information about the sort of jewellery that was worn even in these carnival balls. In 1895, the governor's carnival ball was deemed so splendid that a whole edition of the Daily Malta Chronicle was dedicated to describing it. So we have an account, a wonderful account, within the holdings of Biblioteca as well, where we know exactly what happened, all the proceedings of the evening, how people were welcomed, how they proceeded to eat at the buffet table, then they danced. And it goes on and on. But what for me was particularly relevant was the list of people who were invited to this ball and what they dressed as. It's interesting, for example, they were really very creative. One particular lady, Mrs. Frodsham, decided to dress as backgammon. So she dressed as the game of backgammon, and the description within this wonderful account of the carnival ball says that she had drafts and dice arranged on the costume, and also used as a necklace and bracelets on black velvet. So very original, a one-off piece of jewellery that was decorated with these drafts and dice. One can almost create it is a verbal picture. You can recreate in the mind how this jewellery was worn and what it looked like. So this is extremely valuable in terms of information. But what of other social events? Well, we know that several balls were held during the season, which spanned more or less autumn to winter every year. Started to move into spring as well, and then many families would return back to England, where the climate was obviously cooler. But during the time they were in Malta, many balls were held, sometimes even at home, and in fact they refer to them as at-home events, and they get described again in the newspapers, and this gives us more information. So we know as well that there was royalty in Malta, so although the Maltese were excluded from these events, you can imagine that they would have read the papers out of curiosity to see who was dressed and who was wearing what, and the actual colour of the costume was described, and as well jewellery. So we have examples, for example, On the 4th January 1888, there was a ball held at the Auberge de Provence, what is now the Museum of Archaeology, just down the road from the Biblioteca. And there, the Duchess of Edinburgh reportedly wore magnificent jewels of rubies and diamonds, with a crimson satin dress. How wonderful. While Mrs. Strickland wore black velvet with magnificent diamonds. So we get an idea of what was worn, what was appropriate for big events like this, big social events such as balls. But other events were held and jewellery featured in them as well. Strangely enough, it featured also in sporting events, and we know this once again from the newspapers of the time. How did jewellery feature in sporting events? Well, jewellery was given as prizes for competitions that were held. For example, in 1889, the Malta Chronicle and Garrison Gazette described the naval athletic sports. And they mentioned who the winners were, some ladies. One of them was awarded 30 points and a gold bracelet. Another was given a silver sugar basin, not so bad. Another was given a brooch. So these items of jewellery were considered adequate or good prizes to give to a lady for a sporting event. But other social events which were held open air, for example, picnics, some photos of magnificent picnics held in the Edwardian age show people dressed up in their finest costumes with great big hats, but also with jewellery, of course. So we can get some information from there as well. What about the merchant classes? What about the Maltese of perhaps a higher rank? What were they wearing? Well, if we go back to Carnival, we are lucky that some photos survive of Maltese dressed in Carnival costume. And once again, they really went to town in terms of how they adorned themselves. They really troubled with putting together a very good costume. And invariably, jewellery gets shown. And there are some wonderful photographs from the Giovanni Bonello photograph collection, which show a very rare photographs of these people, of these ladies dressed up in carnival costume with their jewellery. Other social events, weddings. Weddings are always an occasion to display one's jewellery. But they don't only feature, jewellery doesn't only feature in what the guests wear, but also, of course, in what the bride wears, and more particularly, what the bride is given to wear. So we have a description, which once again comes from one of the newspapers within the Biblioteca holdings, of a fashionable wedding. It's called a fashionable wedding. Augusta Golscher, who marries Alfred Denaro in 1893, and the description in the Malta Chronicle and Garrison Gazette of this fashionable wedding says that the bride wore a tulle veil and it was pinned with 2 handsome diamond stars, the gift of her mother. Luckily, a photograph, a hand-coloured photograph, survives of this bride wearing one of these stars in a subsequent occasion. And the diamond arrow, the gift of the bridegroom's uncle. So the bride was gifted with jewellery, and we know from, again, accounts in the newspapers of the time that it was actually appropriate to give a wedding gift, jewellery as a wedding gift to the bride, rather than something that would be enjoyed by both the bride and the groom, as we would tend to do nowadays. So wedding gifts tended to be jewellery items to the bride. We are lucky to have some surviving images of late 18th century brides. In the Zimelli collection at Biblioteca, we have just one depiction of what a bride from the countryside, it says, would have worn. And as well, in the Palazzo Falson collection, there is a completely unique painting, which dates to the late 18th century, of a traditional country wedding. There we don't see any jewellery, but it is very rich in the depiction of costume. Travellers' accounts prove extremely useful in describing the Maltese, especially the Maltese of the villages, and their traditional costume and what jewellery they used to wear. And we get these wonderful descriptions of how the Maltese would really dress up for feasts, for the village feasts. And there are some extremely insightful details. For example, once again, about how even men were loaded with gold and with silver ornaments. This is perhaps one of my favourite descriptions of a Maltese man in the 1830s, described by a Lebanese who settled in Malta for a few years.
They are extremely fond of gold and silver ornaments, and it is not uncommon to see even the peasants loaded with trinkets of these two metals. They ornament their necks with gold and silver chains, sometimes indeed with necklaces of precious stones. Their arms are loaded with bracelets, and their earrings are in general more expensive than elegant. Their shoe buckles are extremely large and always either of solid gold or silver. Among villages, the men have their ears pierced and wear gold earrings. They also let lengths of twisted hair dangle from the temples to the base of the neck. These are feminine characteristics. Some of them wear several gold rings and have the buttons of their waistcoats made of the same metal or of silver. On feast days, a potter or publican of the like will appear with 10 gold rings on his fingers, as many on his watch chain, and numerous gold or silver buttons on his waistcoat.
So this concludes what I discussed in my lecture about joyful jewellery, about how jewellery appears in carnival, in social events, in balls, in weddings, in feasts. But the Biblioteca collection has so much more that gives us much more information about jewellery history throughout the ages. And I'd like to take you along and show you one or two highlights which have helped me develop more the history of jewellery and discover more about our background. Here are a few highlights from the collection of Biblioteca which have been so useful in my research. For example, over here we have a list of the valuables of the Order of St. John, which were held in the tower at the nearby palace. In fact, the list commences with the term Gioie della Torretta Natura, and the very first entry is Una spada e pugnale della Vittoria. This, of course, is the sword and dagger which was given by Philip II to Grand Master de Valette to commemorate the wonderful victory of the Great Siege. That was, of course, considered one of the greatest valuables of the Order of St. John. But the list continues, and there are very good descriptions of jewellery pieces, of precious gems, sometimes loose, sometimes mounted in jewellery items, but also some descriptions which give you an idea on the artistry, on the style that was reflected in these jewellery pieces. For example, una testa di pesce con perle diamanti. So it's clearly an object which was fashioned in the shape of the head of a fish and then encrusted with these pearls and diamonds. We know the year, and we also know the value which is listed. So that helps us enormously in terms of research, of quantifying what there was, what the value of these objects were at the time. Jewellery, gems, these were held in great esteem by heads of state, by kings. So this was something very important at the time. Moving on, here we have a handwritten copy of the 18th century inventory of the conventual church of St. John. The copy was done in the 19th century, so it's also very old. And there are actual depictions. So amongst the list of valuables pertaining to the conventual church of St. John was also a number of jewellery items. And where would these jewellery items be? Well, here they are depicted on the risa, the silver cover of the Madonna of Philermos, which was perhaps the most valuable in terms of religious worth, icon of the miraculous icon within the Church of St. John. And this was studded with jewellery pieces. And in fact, each piece is depicted in great detail, and there are numbers against every jewellery piece, and this had a key. So each number was then listed and a description and a value was given to each jewellery piece. And sometimes they would also, where it was known, they would also list who donated this piece of jewellery to the Madonna of Filermo's as a votive object. Then here we have something extremely rare, which is a very lucky survival. Unfortunately, we don't have many pattern books. Pattern books were essentially sketches, detailed sketches that an artisan would carry around him, especially if he moved from country to country. He would show it to his clients and they would show his repertoire, what he was able to produce for clients. These survive abroad in various collections. In Malta, I wasn't able to find many, and this is a very lucky survival that ended up in a volume of miscellanea, and luckily there's some information as well. A certain Gaetano Rebul encloses these very detailed drawings of jewellery pieces, and you could actually tell from the way the depictions show how the gems were cut. So that gives you information as well, because through the ages, the gems were cut in different styles. And Gaetano Rebul encloses these drawings and says that they pertained to his father, Lorenzo Rebul, who was a goldsmith. So we know that he was producing these sort of jewels. Unfortunately, none survived that I know of. But the search is always on. You never know what you can find tomorrow. In conclusion, I'd like to say that researchers like me spend years and years at Biblioteca, going through several documents and really being able to harvest such a lot of information for our own studies. But it doesn't stop there. We publish, we share information with the public through lectures, we produce books, and these books also end up in the Biblioteca collection, because the Biblioteca is a legal deposit, and any book that is published in Malta becomes part of the collection of Biblioteca as well. So we hope to give back a bit of what we were able to acquire through the study of this really important collection in Malta.